my name is Gladys and my husband's name is Gary.
Do you remember those forgotten TV shows? The ones you grew up with but somehow left behind? In the 1970s, these shows filled our homes with laughter, lessons, and moments that quietly shaped our everyday lives. What else have we left buried in the background of our childhoods? If you were a kid growing up in the 1970s, chances are you learned how to read not from a school teacher but from a sketch comedy show that hit you with more energy than you knew what to do with. That show was The Electric Company. And yes, you forgot you grew up with it. But once it's back in your head, you can probably hear that theme song like it never left. The Electric Company was the cool older sibling to Sesame Street, faster, louder, and just a little bit chaotic in the best way possible. It aired on public television starting in 1971, and its mission was clear: teach reading skills to elementary school kids who were too old for puppets but too young for boredom. Think comic book panels coming to life, goofy wordplay sketches, funky animated shorts, and music videos with real swing to them. They threw everything at the wall, and somehow, it all stuck. What made the Electric Company stand out was that it treated kids like they were smart. Not just kid smart, but actually capable of grasping advanced reading concepts, phonics, punctuation, pronunciation, and vocabulary without being talked down to. You would get a sketch with Bill Cosby or Rita Moreno 1 minute, and then a psychedelic animation teaching the difference between your and your the next. It was education in disguise, and we fell for it completely. And the cast? Let us just say they did not come to play. You had Morgan Freeman, yes, that Morgan Freeman, playing a hip streetwise character named Easy Reader, whose love for books was somehow cooler than anything else on screen. There was also Skip Hinnant, Judy Graubart, and the unmistakable voice of Joan Rivers in the early seasons. They all threw themselves into these over-the-top sketches with such heart and sincerity that even the corniest pun felt like something magical. If you think back, you might remember those little animated words zipping across the screen. "Sound it out," they would say, then split apart and reassemble like a transformer made of syllables. The Silent E song alone deserves its own plaque in the Memory Hall of Fame. And those shadowy voiceovers of two mouths saying a word at the same time? That was peak Electric Company. This show did not just teach us how to read, it taught us to love reading. And that was the real trick. You are 6 or 7 years old, maybe sitting cross-legged on a shag carpet with a bowl of cereal, watching this bright, weird, fast-paced show that makes you feel like words are alive. You do not know you are learning. You just think you are watching something funny and loud. The Electric Company was so embedded in public broadcasting culture that for a while, you could not escape it. It was shown in classrooms. It was on VHS tapes at libraries. Teachers would wheel in the TV cart and everyone would cheer because it meant another visit from Easy Reader or Letterman or Fargo North Decoder. If any of those names ring a bell, you are already smiling. But somehow, the show drifted away from memory. Maybe because it was a little too smart for its own good. Maybe because the cast moved on, or because later educational shows started going more high-tech. Whatever the reason, the Electric Company quietly faded from the mainstream, even though it left a huge mark on a generation of kids. So when you hear the words, "The Electric Company," you might not think much at first, but sit with it for a second. The bright colors, the sound effects, the funky jazz riffs, and the quiet feeling that you are watching something made just for you. It did not just fill the airwaves, it filled our heads with something worth remembering. There is something about the phrase, "land of the lost," that instantly drops you back into that strange and wonderful place where Saturday mornings felt like they belonged to you and you alone. If you were a kid in the 1970s, this show was more than just television. It was an adventure you looked forward to all week. And somehow, despite how unforgettable it was at the time, most of us completely forgot we grew up with it. Land of the Lost premiered in 1974 and came from the endlessly inventive minds of Sid and Marty Krofft, the brothers responsible for half the surreal children's programming that haunted and thrilled us. But this one was different. This was not just singing puppets and glittery sets. This was a live-action science fiction show with a beating heart, real stakes, and some of the most imaginative world-building ever put on a kid's screen. It followed the Marshall family, a father and his two kids, Will and Holly, who got sucked into a strange, prehistoric dimension after going over a waterfall during a routine expedition. What followed was pure 1970s magic. Dinosaurs, talking crystals, alien lizard people called slee stacks, and landscapes that seemed endless even though they were clearly made of cardboard and fog machines. But when you were a kid, you bought into it completely. There was something raw and eerie about Land of the Lost. It did not look polished. The special effects were clunky, the sets were cheap, and the acting was sometimes wooden. But all of that just made it feel more real. It was scrappy and honest, like a story someone told you around a campfire, and that made it stick. And let us not forget the slee stacks. Tall, slow-moving, hissing lizard men with glowing eyes and crossbows. They terrified us, not in the blood and gore horror way, but in that low-budget, I think I dreamed this kind of way. You were never quite sure what they wanted or why they were so quiet, only that they were always watching. And somehow that felt scarier than anything else on television at the time. The real genius of Land of the Lost was how it blended mystery, adventure, and family. It had episodes about time travel, parallel dimensions, moral dilemmas, and alien civilizations, all wrapped in a 20-minute package meant for children. It asked you to think. It made you wonder. And it never once assumed you were too young to handle complex ideas. At the heart of the show was a sense of survival and togetherness. The Marshalls were stranded in a world that made no sense, but they had each other. They built shelter. They solved problems. They tried to get home. And through all the weirdness, there was always a sense that this family was doing their best. That message, quiet, unflashy but powerful, stuck with you longer than you realized. Land of the Lost ran for 3 seasons, and then just like that, it vanished. No dramatic farewell, no send-off episode, just gone. And maybe that is why we forgot it, because it left without warning. But every now and then, when you see a foggy forest or hear a flute-like melody or remember a feeling of quiet awe, you might realize it never left you at all. Watching it now, you will see every flaw, but you will also see a kind of charm that cannot be faked. It was a show that tried, really tried, to give kids a sense of wonder. And in doing that, it gave them something worth carrying into adulthood, even if we forgot. You probably remember the colors before you remember the name. A swirl of orange, red, and yellow spinning across the screen while a group of kids shouted that wild, catchy theme song, "Come on and zoom, 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 a zoom." And if you just sang that in your head, you definitely forgot you grew up with Zoom. Premiering in 1972 on PBS, Zoom was a show made for kids, by kids. Not in a metaphorical way. The entire cast was made up of real children, not actors, and they were the heart and soul of the show. They introduced themselves by first name only, wore t-shirts and jeans, and spoke directly to the audience like they were talking to friends. There were no adults, no teachers, no cartoon sidekicks, just kids like you, hanging out, solving problems, and having fun. It was not polished. That was the point. There was no big studio audience or fancy graphics. The production was raw, minimal, and totally unscripted in parts. And yet somehow that made it feel even more real. The kids on Zoom felt like kids from your school. Like someone you might see riding their bike down the street or climbing the jungle gym during recess. Zoom was also deeply interactive in a way that most television at the time was not. It wanted you to participate. Every episode had science experiments, crafts, games, and songs, all designed to be done at home with stuff you already had. Popsicle sticks, rubber bands, old socks. If you could scrounge it from a junk drawer, it had a place on Zoom. But maybe the most memorable part of the show was something called Zoom Mail. Kids would send in letters with questions, stories, and suggestions for skits or games. The hosts would read them out loud and actually use them on the show. The address? Burned into memory. Zoom, ZOOM, Box 350, Boston, Massachusetts, 0-2-1-3-4. Send it to Zoom. And yes, we all thought it was incredibly cool that your ideas might show up on television. Then there was Ooby Dooby. You either remember it fondly or you have tried very hard to forget. This was the show's made-up language where "ub" was inserted before every vowel sound in a word. It was nonsense, but it was fun nonsense. Kids learned to speak it fluently and drive their parents crazy. That is how deep the love for Zoom ran. The show had an underlying message that is easy to miss in hindsight. It told kids that their voices mattered. It trusted them to speak for themselves, to be silly, smart, creative, weird, and emotional, all at once. There were segments where kids talked about personal challenges, fears, and dreams. Sometimes they just danced. Sometimes they just laughed. And none of it felt fake. For children growing up in the early 1970s, Zoom was a breath of fresh air. It arrived in a time when adult voices dominated the airwaves. And here was this strange, energetic show that said, "We are listening to you." Not in a preachy, condescending way, but in a real, direct, and powerful way. It made kids feel important, like they could create something that mattered. Maybe that is why it quietly faded from our minds. There were no celebrity guest stars, no flashy sets, no reboots with CGI. Zoom existed in its own moment, small, bright, and weirdly perfect. But if you ever find yourself humming that theme song out of nowhere, know this: Zoom is still in there. You just forgot you grew up with it. This one is quieter, less flashy. But if you were a kid watching television in the early 1970s or catching reruns later, you might remember Family Affair not for its plot, but for how it felt. And if you remember a tall man named Mr. French or a little girl clutching a doll named Mrs. Beasley, then you forgot you grew up with this show. Family Affair originally aired from 1966 to 1971, but it stayed in syndication long enough to become a comforting part of early 70s childhood. The story centered around a bachelor named Bill Davis, an upscale New York City engineer with a penthouse apartment and zero parenting experience, who suddenly became the guardian of his orphaned niece and nephews. The setup was simple. 3 children, Buffy, Jody, and Sissy, arrive from Indiana and are dropped into Bill's high-rise, adult-only world. He is not ready. They are grieving. And yet somehow, they all try to make it work. With the help of Mr. French, the proper British gentleman's gentleman who manages the household with a stern exterior and a hidden heart of gold. What made Family Affair special was that it never tried to dazzle you. It was gentle. Every episode moved at a slow, deliberate pace. The dialogue lingered. The camera did not rush. You were allowed to sit with the characters in their awkward, quiet, often emotional moments. That kind of space is rare, especially in shows aimed at families. Buffy was the emotional center of the show. Small, thoughtful, always hugging her doll and looking at the world with wide eyes. Her twin brother Jody had the confident swagger of a kid who did not realize how out of place he was. Sissy, the teenage sister, often served as the in-between, old enough to understand the loss, young enough to still feel helpless. Mr. French, meanwhile, might have started as comic relief, but he quickly became something else entirely. A man who had seen the world but never had a family of his own. He was protective, proud, and incredibly human. And when he let that guard down, even a little, you felt it in your chest. The show touched on grief without turning it into melodrama. It explored what it meant to form a family from pieces. That kind of theme might seem tame today, but back then it was quietly revolutionary. The idea that love could grow not from blood but from effort, and that kids were strong enough to adjust even when nothing made sense. Reruns of Family Affair played throughout the early 70s, and if you were a kid watching after school, chances are you caught an episode or two without even realizing what you were absorbing. Maybe you just liked Buffy's doll. Maybe you liked the idea of a Manhattan apartment with an elevator that opened directly into your living room. Or maybe, without knowing it, you liked how safe it felt. Over time, shows like Family Affair slipped into the background. They were too quiet, too earnest. They were replaced by louder comedies, faster edits, and bigger laughs. But if you ever see a photo of a doll with glasses and a bonnet, or hear someone speak in a clipped British accent and feel something warm click into place, that is memory. That is family affair. You forgot you grew up with it, but you did. You ever have one of those memories where you think, did I dream that? That is what Sigmund and the Sea Monsters feels like. A seaweed-covered creature hiding in a cave, befriending two human boys while living in a world full of wild costumes and even wilder logic. It sounds made up, but if you were a kid in the 1970s, this was Saturday morning gold. And yes, you forgot you grew up with it. The show debuted in 1973 and came from the minds of Sid and Marty Krofft, masters of creating TV that felt like a fever dream stitched together with puppets and glitter. They were the same duo behind HR Pufnstuf and Land of the Lost, and they never played it safe. With Sigmund, they gave us something uniquely weird. A misunderstood sea monster with a heart of gold who runs away from his abusive monster family and finds refuge with two beachside brothers. Yes, really. The real appeal of the show was that it played directly into a kid's fantasy. What if you discovered something magical, something not from this world, and it wanted to be your friend? That idea hit you right in the childhood. It gave you a sense of ownership, of power, of wonder. You could imagine sneaking Sigmund into your treehouse, teaching him how to read, hiding him from your parents. It was the kind of secret that felt good to keep. And the villains? They were not your usual monsters. Sigmund's own family, his brothers Blurp and Slurp, were the bullies of the undersea world, constantly trying to drag him back into a life of scaring humans. But Sigmund wanted no part of it. He wanted peanut butter sandwiches and skateboards. It was funny, but it was also kind of heartbreaking. Even as kids, we knew what it felt like to not fit in. The production values were low, but the charm was high. The monster suits were clunky, and the sets were clearly plywood painted to look like coral reefs. But somehow, none of that mattered. The colors were bright, the music was catchy, and the message was always warm. You are allowed to be different. You are allowed to be kind. What is easy to forget is how cool the show tried to be. Surfboards leaned against the house. There were musical montages. The boys wore bell-bottoms and shaggy haircuts. It was unmistakably the 1970s, right down to the cheesy transitions and wah-wah guitar riffs. But when you were a kid, it felt modern. It felt like something older kids watched. And because of that, it felt like you were being let in on something just a little bit grown up. As with most Krofft productions, Sigmund and the Sea Monsters did not stick around forever. It lasted only 2 seasons, then faded into reruns and eventually into the fog of forgotten TV. But that does not mean it did not matter. If you were a certain kind of kid, sensitive, imaginative, maybe a little different yourself, then Sigmund was more than a monster. He was a friend, one you never really stopped thinking about, even if you forgot his name. Some shows do not need big storylines or flashy visuals to leave a lasting mark. The Courtship of Eddie's Father is one of those shows. If the name sounds vaguely familiar but you are not sure why, there is a reason for that. It worked its way into your heart so quietly you never even noticed. And now you have forgotten you grew up with it. The show first aired in 1969 and ran until 1972, but it was in the reruns of the early 1970s that it really became a part of daily life for a lot of kids. At its core, it was a gentle story about a widowed father, Tom Corbett, and his young son Eddie. They lived together in a modest Los Angeles apartment, navigating life, love, and growing up one day at a time. Tom, played by Bill Bixby, was not the typical TV dad. He was warm without being cheesy, smart without being smug. He listened more than he lectured, and his relationship with Eddie felt real. Not perfect, not scripted, just real. They talked about everything, from school trouble to missing Eddie's mom to whether or not Tom should start dating again. And the show never rushed those conversations. It gave them room to breathe. Eddie, played by Brandon Cruz, was just as important to the magic. He was not precocious in the annoying sitcom way. He was curious, earnest, always trying to play matchmaker for his dad, which led to some of the show's lighter moments. But underneath all that mischief was a kid who missed his mother and wanted his dad to be happy. That longing was never overplayed, but it was always there, and it made everything else hit harder. Then there was Mrs. Livingston, the housekeeper from Japan who became part of their little family. Played by Miyoshi Umeki, she brought a kind of gentle wisdom that stood out in a world of loud sitcom characters. She always called Tom Mr. Eddie's father, and every time she appeared, you knew the episode was going to slow down and say something real. Her presence gave the show a softness and sincerity that was rare then, and even rarer now. The courtship of Eddie's father did something brave. It made space for emotion. It was not afraid of sadness. It was not afraid of quiet. That might not sound revolutionary today, but back then, most television tried to fill every second with jokes or drama. This show let you sit with a feeling. And for kids who were used to flashing lights and cartoon antics, that meant something. You probably did not watch this show for the plot. You watched it for the feeling. It made you want to be more thoughtful. It made you want to hug your dad or call your mom. It made you think about what it means to take care of someone and how tricky and beautiful that can be. Over time, the show faded. Its name started to sound old-fashioned. It got filed away in the wholesome but forgettable part of television history. But the truth is, the courtship of Eddie's father was never forgettable. It just got quiet. And sometimes, the quietest things are the hardest to hear again, until one day they come back and you remember how much they meant. You might not think of Chips as a kid's show, but for a certain group of children growing up in the late 1970s, it absolutely was. Not because it was meant for kids, but because it had everything we secretly wanted: speed, danger, uniforms, and two impossibly cool motorcycle cops who looked like real-life superheroes. And if you were one of those kids glued to the screen on a Saturday night, then yes, you forgot you grew up with Chips. Debuting in 1977, Chips followed California Highway Patrol officers John Baker and Frank Poncherello, better known as John and Ponch, as they cruised the sun-drenched freeways of Los Angeles on their motorcycles, chasing down speeders, solving crimes, and somehow still making time to flirt with everyone they met. But for kids watching at home, the appeal was way simpler. They were fast, fearless, and just plain fun. Everything about the show screamed cool. The opening credits alone could rev you up. Gleaming chrome, revving engines, and that theme song that felt like it belonged in a toy commercial. The motorcycles were the stars in our eyes, more than the actors. When you were 7 or 8 years old, watching Ponch pop a wheelie felt like witnessing a superpower in action. But Chips was not just about action. It had a strange warmth, a sense of lightheartedness that made it safe enough for younger viewers, even if it was technically aimed at adults. The criminals were usually more goofy than dangerous, and no one ever really got hurt. There were car chases, yes, but also plenty of beach scenes, community picnics, and roller disco. It was part cop drama, part sun-soaked California fantasy. John and Ponch had one of the best buddy dynamics on television. John was the calm, rule-following one, while Ponch was the hothead with a heart of gold. Together, they were always getting into trouble, then talking their way out of it with a grin and a handshake. For young viewers, their friendship was half the magic. You did not just want to be like them, you wanted a friend like that. And let us be honest, a lot of kids picked a favorite. You were either Team John or Team Ponch. If you were Team Ponch, you liked his swagger, his charm, and his sunglasses. If you were Team John, you liked his quiet confidence and that perfect California smile. Either way, you had posters, toy motorcycles, or maybe just a growing belief that one day you too could ride into the wind with purpose and style. What is funny is that most adults saw Chips as kind of corny, but for kids, that did not matter. We were not looking for realism. We were looking for excitement, for adventure, for that jolt of adrenaline that came from flashing lights and sirens. And in those moments, sitting cross-legged on the floor, face inches from the TV, Chips gave us exactly what we needed. Over the years, the show faded into the background, overshadowed by darker, grittier cop dramas that followed. But its legacy lives on in every kid who rode their bike too fast pretending it was a patrol motorcycle or shouted 10-4 into a toy walkie-talkie. Chips might not have been made for kids, but somehow it became ours anyway. There is a moment in every childhood when you discover something so strange, so specific, that you are not sure if you made it up. That is exactly what Josie and the Pussycats in Outer Space feels like. A cartoon about an all-girl pop band accidentally launched into the cosmos, running from aliens and singing songs in between. If you are nodding along right now, it means one thing. You forgot you grew up with it. Spinning off from the original Josie and the Pussycats show, which was itself a spin-off of the Archie comics, this version took a hard left turn into science fiction in 1972. The original band, Josie, Melody, and Valerie, were still there, still wearing leopard print jumpsuits, still jamming with their bubblegum rock songs. But now, they were stuck in space after a launch gone wrong, drifting from planet to planet with a spaceship full of oddball characters. The premise was wild, even by Saturday morning standards. Imagine Scooby-Doo meets Star Trek, with a dash of the monkeys thrown in for good measure. Every episode, the gang would land on a new alien world, get caught in some local conflict, and then narrowly escape in time to perform a song and fly off again. It made no sense, but that was half the fun. Josie was the leader, grounded and determined. Melody was the ditzy blonde drummer with a heart of gold. Valerie, the bassist and engineer, was cool, capable, and far ahead of her time. In fact, Valerie was one of the first black female characters in a Saturday morning cartoon, and she saved the group's lives more times than anyone ever gave her credit for. That alone makes the show worth remembering. And then there was Alexandra, the classic antagonist-turned-tag-along who spent most of her time sabotaging things and pining for Alan, Josie's boyfriend. Her cat, Sebastian, often did more to fix problems than she did. It was silly, it was repetitive, but it was comfort food for kids who wanted music, space travel, and just a little bit of girl power. The music was another major part of the show's charm. Every episode featured an original song, catchy, upbeat, and somehow always relevant to the story. Think simple lyrics, basic harmonies, and that unmistakable 1970s cartoon band vibe. You did not watch Josie and the Pussycats in Outer Space just for the plot. You watched for the performance. The animation was classic Hanna-Barbera, limited motion, repeated backgrounds, characters running past the same rock 3 times. But it had personality. Colorful planets, goofy aliens, and spaceships with blinking lights filled the screen. You might not remember the details, but you remember how it felt. Fast-paced, fun, and just the right amount of strange. It only lasted for 1 season, 13 episodes. That is it. And maybe that is why it faded so quickly from memory. But if you were the kind of kid who liked your cartoons with a little weirdness and a lot of rhythm, then Josie and the Pussycats in Outer Space probably meant more to you than you realized. So if you ever catch a glimpse of a glittery headband, hear a cartoon guitar riff, or see a leopard print outfit that looks just a little too familiar, do not be surprised when a memory crashes down like a spaceship re-entering Earth. You did not imagine it. You just forgot you grew up with it. There was a time when every kid had a favorite TV dog. For some, it was Lassie. For others, it might have been Benji. But if you grew up in the 1970s, there's a good chance your favorite was a German Shepherd named Joe. And if the phrase "Run, Joe, run" brings up even the faintest flicker of emotion, that is because you forgot you grew up with it. The show aired on NBC's Saturday morning lineup starting in 1974, and while it never became a massive hit, it held a very specific emotional weight. It was about Joe, a military canine falsely accused of attacking his handler. Instead of being put down, he escaped and became a kind of 4-legged fugitive traveling the country, dodging capture and helping people along the way. Think The Fugitive, but with paws and a much sadder face. Every episode had the same rhythm. Joe would wander into a new town, meet someone in trouble, a lost child, a family in distress, a lonely outsider, and he would help them quietly and bravely. Then, just when things seemed settled, he would be forced to move on, alone. The episodes ended the way they began, with Joe running. It hit kids harder than they realized. Joe was the ultimate good guy, loyal, brave, and gentle, but he could not go home. And that was the part that stuck with you. You watched the show for the adventure, but what you really felt was the heartbreak of not belonging anywhere. Joe was not just running, he was searching. The show was simple, but it did not talk down to you. It trusted you to understand loneliness. It asked you to care about something that could not talk but said everything with his eyes. Joe's story was not about punishment or justice. It was about kindness, and about how that kindness could be given and received even by someone who had every reason to stop trusting the world. It has been decades since Joe's paw prints faded from Saturday mornings. But if you ever find yourself moved by a story about a lost animal or catch a glimpse of a German shepherd out of the corner of your eye, you might just remember the dog who never stopped running and wonder why you ever let him go. Before YouTube, before Instagram, before Google Earth, there was a little show called Big Blue Marble that quietly taught a generation of kids that the world was a lot bigger and a lot more connected than they ever imagined. If the name sounds vaguely familiar but you cannot place it, do not worry. You just forgot you grew up with it. Premiering in 1974 and airing through the decade, Big Blue Marble was part documentary, part travelogue, and part cultural exchange. It featured real kids from around the globe sharing what their lives looked like, their schools, their homes, their families, their games, and suddenly, a kid in Minnesota was watching how a kid in Kenya fetched water, or how a girl in Japan celebrated her birthday. It was not flashy, it was not loud, but it was real. There was something calming about the way the show unfolded. It had soft music, gentle narration, and a kind of sincerity that you could feel, even if you were only 7 years old. The world felt huge, but it also felt close. Different, but not distant. And in a time when most kids' shows were either cartoons or lessons, Big Blue Marble offered something different: perspective. It also gave kids a voice, literally. There was a segment where viewers could become pen pals with children from other countries. You would send in your letter, hoping it might get picked, and if it did, you would be connected with someone your age on the other side of the world. In the age of instant messaging, that might not sound like much, but back then, it felt like time travel. Big Blue Marble was not trying to be exciting. It was trying to be human. And maybe that is why it has been so easy to forget. But for kids who grew up watching it, it planted something deep: curiosity, empathy, a desire to learn without being told to. And that is no small thing. So if you ever see a spinning globe or hear the phrase, "It is a small world after all," and feel a weird kind of warmth, you are probably remembering this little show that showed you the big world. You just forgot you grew up with it. Marty Feldman was impossible to forget. Those wide eyes, that surreal humor, that presence. Already a star in Britain, Feldman brought his signature style to American television in the Marty Feldman Comedy Machine. It was a sketch show that took absurdity seriously. The pace was fast, the visuals wild, and the tone unapologetically weird. Feldman was the kind of performer who could turn nonsense into poetry, if you were willing to go along for the ride. But American audiences in the early 1970s were not quite ready for it. The show was a whirlwind of bizarre sketches, musical numbers, and animated interludes. One moment he was impersonating a dictator in a tutu, the next he was playing chess with a chicken. It had more in common with Monty Python than with anything on American prime time. And that was the problem. The cultural gap was just a little too wide. Audiences were used to the familiar rhythm of variety shows, not the frenetic chaos of British surrealism. Viewers were confused, advertisers were wary, critics admired Feldman's genius but questioned the format's accessibility. Despite strong backing and an ambitious slate of episodes, the Comedy Machine sputtered out after just one season. Feldman would go on to have success in films, especially with roles like Igor in Young Frankenstein. But this television experiment became more of a cult curiosity than a breakthrough. Today, it is a relic of creative risk, a show that swung for the fences and missed, but missed in a way that still dazzles. Not all brilliance lands. Sometimes it just flashes once and vanishes. The Colgate Comedy Hour was not just another variety show, it was an event. Airing live from 1950 to 1955, it brought the electric chaos of the stage directly into the homes of millions. Hosted by a rotating cast of comedy legends like Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, Eddie Cantor, and Abbott and Costello, the show captured a kind of energy that no scripted sitcom ever could. It was unpredictable, unpolished, and wildly entertaining. Every week was a gamble, a new experiment in whether or not the comedians could top their last performance. And more often than not, they did. It was a golden age of television in the raw, where mistakes happened on air and the audience loved it more for that. You felt the tension in every live performance. Anything could go wrong, and sometimes it did. But that chaos made it human, alive, and impossible to turn away from. It was the only place where you could see slapstick, song, and celebrity all within the same breath. And at its best, it felt like the whole country was in on the joke at the same time. The competition with The Ed Sullivan Show was fierce, and at times it looked like Colgate might actually win. But time plays favorites, and while Ed Sullivan became immortal, Colgate Comedy Hour became something else, a memory. It disappeared almost as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving only clips and scattered references behind. Yet for those who watched it, those Sunday nights were unforgettable. You did not just laugh, you roared. You shouted across the room. You felt alive. It was theater, comedy, and chaos wrapped into 1 hour of brilliance. In a sea of over-the-top teen dramas and goofy comedies, the Mystery Files of Shelby Woo stood out by being both grounded and bold. Shelby Woo was not a pop star or a secret princess. She was just a smart, curious teenager with a badge-shaped dream and a knack for uncovering the truth. Set in a sleepy Florida town, the show followed Shelby as she interned at the local police department while juggling school, friendships, and all the usual teenage trials. But Shelby's world was not just locker notes and after-school crushes. It was suspects, clues, and dead ends. She was relentless, observant, brave, and most importantly, she listened. It was not just about solving mysteries. It was about learning who you are when no one else sees you clearly. Shelby's quiet tenacity made her a role model for kids who felt underestimated, unseen, or overlooked. Where other shows gave us caricatures of teens, Shelby Woo gave us someone who felt real. Not perfect, not invincible, just determined. The show had a quiet confidence to it. It did not rely on special effects or trendy lingo. It let the stories carry the weight. It gave kids the benefit of the doubt that they could handle mystery, complexity, and moral ambiguity, that maybe they wanted more than just punchlines. Shelby broke the mold not by being loud, but by being thoughtful. She was proof that curiosity could be cool, that asking questions could be power. The series slowly faded from the spotlight as flashier content took over, but it left behind something rare, a girl detective who did not need to be superhuman to be unforgettable. Mr. Smith was one of those shows where you had to pause and ask, did someone really greenlight this? The entire pitch could have fit on a cocktail napkin. What if a talking orangutan became a political advisor in Washington, D.C.? No, not a joke. That was the actual show. A real orangutan wearing a three-piece suit with the IQ of a genius and the attitude of a late-night comedian. And somehow, Mr. Smith was supposed to help fix American politics. You know, just casual chimpanzee policy reform. His name was not just for show. The orangutan, named Smith, could speak, not in grunts or gestures, but full sentences in fluent English. Thanks to a secret experimental serum, because of course there was a serum, he became super intelligent and was immediately roped into the government's inner circle. And if your brain is already screaming, wait, what? Good. That means you were alive during the 1980s and remember just how weird television got when no one was looking. Now imagine being a kid and turning on the television after school. You are expecting cartoons or slapstick comedy. But instead you get a dignified ape giving legal advice and weighing in on foreign policy. He did interviews, he held press conferences. He literally had a desk and an office, and somehow, no one in the show found this horrifying. The strangest part? The humans around him just kind of accepted it. They were mildly annoyed, occasionally confused, but not nearly as freaked out as you would expect. It was like Planet of the Apes had a baby with the West Wing, and no one stopped to ask if that made sense. And the jokes? Oh, they were strange. Mr. Smith would throw shade at senators, break the fourth wall, and sip coffee like he had just finished negotiating peace treaties. He was smarter than every adult in the room, and he knew it. Honestly, kids probably tuned in just to see what he would do next. Wear glasses? Type a memo? Roast a government official on national television? Every episode felt like someone's dream sequence that escaped into the real world. Of course, behind the scenes, it was not all smooth sailing. Working with a real orangutan meant every take was unpredictable, but that unpredictability only made the show more surreal. You never quite knew if you were watching a sitcom or a psychological experiment. And for kids who grew up in that weird window of television history, Mr. Smith left a mark. It reminded us that intelligence could come from anywhere, even a primate in a power tie. And maybe, just maybe, Washington needed a little more fur and a lot less ego. The concept was pure late 60s brilliance. A group of idealistic college students crash land on a mysterious island where the adult world no longer exists. No teachers, no parents, no government, just a blank slate to rebuild society from scratch. The new people was meant to be bold, a mirror held up to the counterculture generation. It blended themes of Lord of the Flies and Gilligan's Island, but with a serious tone and moral undertones. And yet, for all its ambition, the show never really worked. It aired on ABC as part of a half-hour drama experiment and never had time to breathe. Episodes felt rushed, ideas half-formed. The writing wrestled with big questions: freedom, power, equality, but the characters remained shallow and their struggles felt like debates rather than drama. The sets were plain, the stakes low. Viewers tuned in out of curiosity but quickly lost interest. Ratings sagged. The network gave it 17 episodes, but the cultural revolution it wanted to ignite never came. What should have been groundbreaking ended up feeling like a lecture. Even the cast, filled with fresh-faced newcomers, seemed lost in the tone shifts. There was potential in every frame, but no spark, no urgency, no heart. Today, The New People is more a forgotten experiment than a failure, one of those rare shows where the premise outshined every part of the execution. A utopia left unexplored, a generation's voice that never found the right words. The Bigalow Theater was one of those brief glimmers in television history that seemed to burn too brightly and too fast. Airing from 1950 to 1951, it lived a strange dual life, first as a CBS anthology drama and later repackaged for Dumont under various names. At its core, it was a stage for stories, real ones, deep ones, sometimes even a little too ambitious for their times. Each episode was a self-contained play, complete with rising tension and dramatic conclusions that tried to stretch the television format beyond its early limits. But here's what sets it apart: the talent it attracted. A young James Dean appeared on it before he became legend. George C. Scott showed up long before anyone called him iconic. For one brief, shining moment, the Bigalow Theater was a springboard for greatness. It was the kind of show that didn't just cast actors, it captured them at the edge of becoming icons. There was a rawness in the performances, a feeling that no one quite knew they were making history. Every episode felt like a rehearsal for something much bigger, but no less sincere. And because of that, it became a quiet archive of American talent right before it exploded. But it never quite caught the public's imagination in the way its network hoped. It lacked flash. It asked its viewers to pay attention, to feel something. That was a lot to ask from a post-war America that just wanted to laugh or sing. And so it faded, quietly, almost politely, into television's attic of forgotten names. But those performances, those early, trembling moments of greatness, they remain buried in dusty kinescopes, just waiting for someone to remember. Some shows are just too weird and wonderful to survive. The Adventures of Brisco County Jr. was one of them. Imagine a show that mixed cowboy shootouts with futuristic science fiction, where a Harvard-educated bounty hunter rode horseback through the Wild West, chasing outlaws and ancient alien technology. It should not have worked, but somehow it did. Bruce Campbell's Brisco was charming, sharp, and oddly philosophical for a man in spurs. The tone was part Western, part comic book, and part pulp serial, and all heart. It winked at the camera, but never lost its soul. There were glowing orbs, steampunk gadgets, and a subplot about time-traveling artifacts that felt wildly out of place, and yet completely right. It was not just about justice, it was about belief. Belief in progress, in legacy, in the idea that even the Wild West had a future worth dreaming of. But television did not know what to do with it. The ratings were decent, the fan base was devoted, but it was too different, too out there. After one season, it was gone. One of the most original shows of the 1990s disappeared into the void while the world chose safer stories. Now, it lives on in whispers, on fan forums, in dusty DVD collections, in the memories of those who knew television had stumbled upon something special and let it slip away. Brisco County was ahead of its time. Maybe that was the problem. Or maybe the real adventure was just getting to see it at all. My Mother the Car is one of those sitcoms that even sounds made up when you say it out loud. The title tells you everything you need to know. A man discovers that his late mother has been reincarnated as a 1928 Porter automobile. Yes, a car that talks and nags and gives life advice through the radio. The moment you hear that, your brain kind of short-circuits. But in 1965, someone decided that was primetime material, and the result was one of the strangest sitcoms to ever hit the airwaves. And yes, it haunted rerun blocks all through the 1980s. The main character, Dave Crabtree, buys the car, and it immediately starts talking to him, in his mom's voice. She says she was reincarnated through transmigration of the soul, whatever that means, and is now here to guide him through life. And by guide, we mean completely micromanage every decision he makes, including his career, his parenting, and his love life. So you had a fully grown man being parented by a classic car with a personality. And not just any personality, the kind that honks if you ignore her advice. It was part sitcom, part metaphysical meltdown, and somehow still managed to feel like a family show. Watching it was like attending a therapy session inside a used car lot. The car had headlights that blinked, doors that swung open dramatically, and a dashboard that somehow expressed disappointment. And even though Dave tried to keep this supernatural secret from his friends and family, he was constantly caught talking to his vehicle, at red lights, in parking lots, in the driveway. Imagine being a neighbor and watching that happen. You would be dialing the local psychiatric hotline before your morning coffee even finished brewing. But the weirdness did not stop there. The car had opinions on everything, and she was never afraid to share them. She meddled in her son's job interviews. She gave unwanted advice during dates. She even guilt-tripped him into doing chores. And the kicker? The car's voice, a refined maternal tone, came through the radio like it was your local AM station of eternal judgment. It was the sitcom equivalent of a hallucination with a laugh track. But somehow, it worked just enough to become a cult classic. Not because it made sense, it did not, but because it was so unapologetically strange. And it stuck around in reruns well into the 1980s, where a whole new generation of kids got exposed to the sheer madness of a man arguing with his car in broad daylight. Watching My Mother the Car as a kid felt like finding a glitch in the television matrix. It made you question how stories even got made. Who sat in a meeting and said, "Let us take grief, reincarnation, vintage vehicles, and put it all in a 30-minute comedy block." And more importantly, why did it kind of work? It left kids with a weird but oddly heartwarming idea. Maybe your mom is always with you, even if she now runs on gasoline. My Mother the Car was not about logic. It was about loyalty, family, and the strange comfort of knowing someone has your back, even if they are in the garage. It was a sitcom with bark, but no bite. Mgherk. A Dog's Life featured actors in full-body dog costumes, playing a family of suburban canines navigating everyday problems like job interviews, neighborhood feuds, and raising puppies. Yes, really. It sounds like a bizarre fever dream, and watching it felt even stranger. The actors, muffled by their rubber dog heads, delivered dialogue through stiff movements and awkward lip-syncing. The humor relied on canine puns and human situations made weirder by the fact that everyone was dressed like a golden retriever. The show's premise was never fully explained. Were these dogs living in a world of humans? Were they symbolic? Satirical? No one knew, and that uncertainty made it nearly impossible for viewers to connect. Audiences were bewildered, critics were harsh, even kids, who were assumed to be the target audience, seemed more confused than entertained. NBC hoped it would be a quirky, family-friendly hit, but Mgherk stumbled out of the gate. The novelty wore off fast. Once you got past the initial shock of talking dogs in business suits, there was not much left. No sharp writing, no emotional core, just a lot of wagging tails and sitcom tropes buried in fur. The show lasted only a handful of episodes before being quietly retired. Few mourned its passing. But in its own strange way, Mgherk has become a cult legend. Proof that in the 1970s, networks were willing to try anything, even a dog suit sitcom. Today, it stands as one of the oddest experiments to ever grace prime time. A surreal reminder that television's strangest ideas sometimes make it all the way to air. Super Train was a show that promised the future and delivered a train wreck. Literally. Picture this: a massive nuclear-powered train that had everything from gyms to swimming pools to full-blown nightclubs, speeding across America like a landlocked spaceship. It was NBC's answer to The Love Boat, except instead of a cruise, you were on rails. And instead of smooth sailing, it was a multi-million-dollar gamble that crashed and burned faster than anyone expected. The production budget was astronomical for its time, higher than anything else on television in 1979. They even built a giant set and miniature models for the train itself. But viewers, they just didn't show up. The stories on board were supposed to be romantic and dramatic and weekly anthologies, but the scripts were flat and the characters forgettable. It aired on Sunday nights, and NBC had high hopes that it would become the next big thing. Instead, Super Train became the poster child for overambition. Critics tore it apart, and within a few months, it was gone. Still, for a show that failed so spectacularly, it left behind something rare. Footage that looks like retrofuturism exploded all over your screen. It's wild, lavish sets, bright lights, an entire casino inside a train. You cannot look away. It's hard not to respect just how bold it was, even if it collapsed under its own weight. Super Train was flashy, short-lived, and unforgettable for all the wrong, and maybe just a few right, reasons. There was something strange and beautiful about this show, like a bedtime story wrapped in a sitcom. Nanny and the Professor was about a mysterious English nanny named Phoebe Figalili, who arrived out of nowhere to care for the chaotic household of Professor Everett and his 3 kids. She had an air of magic about her, never overt, never explained, but always understood. This was not a flashy show. There were no laugh tracks forcing you to find it funny, no obvious special effects screaming for attention. Instead, it asked you to believe, to trust that sometimes the people who save us do not come with explanations. They just show up quietly, like Nanny did, and make life a little better without asking for anything in return. There were whispers that she was psychic. Some thought she was a witch, but it never mattered. What mattered was that she taught 3 kids and a tired, widowed professor how to feel joy again. And for a brief moment in television history, that kind of emotional rescue was enough. When the show ended after just 2 seasons, it left behind a strange sense of unresolved wonder. We never found out who Nanny really was. Maybe that was the point. Some people are not meant to stay. They just pass through when you need them most. Like a childhood memory you can almost remember, but not quite. The Charmings was one of those shows that sounded like a setup for a joke. What if Snow White and Prince Charming moved to modern-day Los Angeles? But in 1987, someone said, "Let's roll with it." And the result was a sitcom so bizarre, it felt like a fairy tale collided headfirst with a sitcom from the mall era. And it did not stop there. Snow White, the prince, their two kids, the evil queen, and even a talking magic mirror, all crammed into one suburban home like it was totally normal. Because apparently, getting cursed into a centuries-long sleep is not nearly as confusing as trying to work a microwave. That was the whole premise. Fairy tale royalty wakes up in Reagan-era California and tries to live like regular Americans. Prince Charming gets a job. Snow White tries to make friends. Their kids go to school. And the evil queen? She lives in the basement and plots passive-aggressive revenge while doing laundry. This show did not just ask you to suspend disbelief, it drop-kicked it off a castle tower. And that was exactly why it stuck in the minds of every 1980s kid who watched it. Watching fairy tale characters adjust to traffic jams, phone bills, and toaster ovens was oddly satisfying. It was like a bedtime story went rogue and moved into your cul-de-sac. The comedy came from how completely unprepared the Charmings were for the modern world. Snow White had no idea what a credit card was. The prince thought garbage disposals were monsters, and the evil queen, who should have been locked up centuries ago, was instead getting into passive showdowns with neighbors and secretly manipulating household electronics. But the weirdest part? They were actually kind of good at adapting. Like within 3 episodes, they had already figured out how to pay taxes, drive minivans, and buy cheese in plastic wrap. And no one questioned it. Not the school teachers, not the grocery clerks, not even the people next door. Because in sitcom land, anything goes as long as you return the shopping cart. The magic mirror was another level of strange. He lived in the hallway, had the voice of a cranky uncle, and would dish out sarcastic wisdom every time someone walked by. Imagine getting life advice from a wall ornament while brushing your teeth. That was just normal in this house. The show played it all totally straight. No meta jokes, no winks at the camera, just full-on fairy tale chaos with a laugh track. And that is what made the Charmings unforgettable. It was not trying to be a spoof or a parody. It was genuinely trying to show how fairy tale characters would survive in the suburbs. There was heart in the chaos. Snow White genuinely wanted to be a good mom. The prince wanted to provide for his family. And the queen? Well, she just wanted her powers back. And maybe a little respect. Same as any grandma. Even though it only lasted 1 season, the Charmings gave 1980s kids something weirdly comforting. The idea that even if you come from another world, you can still figure out how to use a dishwasher and fall asleep to late-night television. It reminded us that family is family, whether you rule a kingdom or just share a bathroom with a talking mirror and an ex-witch. There was a time when a television pitch like 5 fun-loving guys on a houseboat was enough to greenlight an entire series. That was the case with The San Pedro Beach Bums, a comedy about a group of carefree men navigating life, friendship, and misadventure from their floating home off the coast of Southern California. ABC hoped the easygoing vibe would charm audiences, offering something breezy and light in contrast to the heavier dramas of the time. But the result was a show that felt as aimless as its characters. The cast was likable, if underdeveloped. Each episode centered around antics that rarely built into anything memorable. Pranks, misunderstandings, and goofball schemes were the main menu items. It was a series that chased laughs without ever really earning them. The humor was broad, the stakes low. Even the location, a picturesque beach setting, felt underused. And with so many characters sharing the spotlight, no one truly stood out. Viewers tuned in expecting a blend of the Monkees and Happy Days. What they got was a sitcom without structure, floating from episode to episode without any clear direction. Critics called it lightweight and forgettable. Ratings were lukewarm. After just 10 episodes, the bums were evicted from the network's lineup. Sliders was one of those rare science fiction shows that handed its audience the keys to the multiverse and then quietly slipped out the back door. Premiering in 1995, the series followed a group of travelers who slid between parallel universes, each one slightly or wildly different from their own. It was clever, imaginative, and packed with potential. One world would be ruled by technology, another by communism. Some were utopias, most were nightmares. The concept was lightning in a bottle. But television, as always, is complicated. Behind the scenes, the show was plagued by network meddling, cast changes, and creative clashes. What started as thoughtful science fiction turned slowly into formulaic adventure. One of the show's greatest strengths was its premise. What if one decision created a whole new world? That idea alone had enough weight to carry 10 seasons, if not more. But too often, the show's smartest ideas got buried beneath budget cuts and behind-the-scenes drama. It bounced from Fox to the Sci-Fi Channel, and in the process, lost its rhythm. Characters were written off, the tone shifted, and that initial sense of wonder, the thrill of infinite possibilities, got buried under clunky plot lines. Still, for those who watched it, Sliders was unforgettable. The idea that there were versions of our world just a step away lit up the imagination. It made you question the smallest choices. The what-ifs. The roads not taken. And even now, in a media landscape drowning in multiverse stories, Sliders is rarely mentioned. It was a pioneer without a monument. A bold idea that came before audiences were ready and was gone before they could catch up. If one of these shows just came rushing back like a long-lost friend, tell us which one in the comments. Tap that like button to keep the memories alive and subscribe so you never miss a chance to remember what mattered.